Boa tarde. É, hoje, mais uma vez, eu apareço aqui. Hoje eu estou uma coisa terrível. Eu vou participar de todos esses eventos de hoje, mas também vocês se livram de mim. Eu só vou aparecer de novo na sexta-feira, no encerramento, e na palestra da Ludmilla também, né? É, Bom, hoje é com grande prazer, né, que eu vou, estou apresentando, né, meu colega e amigo George Bisharat. George Bisharat é um scholar, né? É um colega meu de Harvard. Ele, em Harvard, ao mesmo tempo que eu entrei, ele é da minha turma. Ele estudou antropologia, o doutorado em antropologia, e se formou em direito. Isso ao mesmo tempo. Só aí vocês veem que o sujeito não é uma coisa, né, fácil. A tese dele foi sobre o Oriente Médio, sobre a Palestina, debaixo vamos dizer, do Estado israelense, né, do direito israelense, e como é que os palestinos, vamos dizer, têm que se virar, né, para administrar os seus conflitos no meio dessa coisa colonial, né, que é a dominação israelense sobre a Palestina. Além disso, né, em 1990, quando eu fui fazer uma pesquisa de campo nos Estados Unidos sobre a justiça criminal e a segurança pública, eu estive em Birmingham, Alabama, para estudar a polícia de lá, que é uma polícia muito famosa, né, pelos seus preconceitos, etc. E depois eu fui para São Francisco, na Califórnia, onde o George era defensor público. E ele, então, me conduziu, né, pelos trâmites da Defensoria Pública de São Francisco, e foi uma coisa muito esclarecedora, né, observar, não agora a polícia, mas os tribunais. Aliás, isso porque lá em Birmingham eu descobri que lá nos Estados Unidos você não pode estudar a polícia e os advogados de defesa ao mesmo tempo, porque eles acham que isso é uma incompatibilidade, né? Então, ou você estuda uma coisa, ou você estuda a outra. E eu tive que estudar em dois lugares diferentes. E depois, em 2011 e 2012, eu voltei a Hastings College of the Law, que é o nome da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade da Califórnia em São Francisco, a que o George pertence. Aliás, pertencia, porque eles agora tiraram o nome de Hastings da faculdade, porque descobriram que esse Hastings era um sujeito que, no século XIX, né, lá com aquela corrida do ouro da Califórnia, matou uma opção de gente, índio, e o diabo a quatro e tal. Então, eles passaram uma lei lá para tirar na Assembleia Legislativa, né, da Califórnia, para tirar esse Hastings do nome da faculdade. Mas eu entrei na internet, ainda está Hastings lá, então eu estou mantendo esse título mais breve. Esse é a Universidade da Califórnia de São Francisco, College of Law. E ele também, depois de ser defensor público, ele então se dedicou posteriormente, né, exclusivamente ao ensino. Então, ele é professor de processo penal na Hastings College of Law, né? Ele é um professor of law, que quer dizer que ele é um professor, um full professor, né? Um professor titular dessa faculdade, que é a faculdade de direito mais antiga da Califórnia, né? E ele lá é uma faculdade fica no centro de São Francisco, é muito interessante, eu já estive lá várias vezes, né? Além disso, né, como eu disse, eu conheci o George em 1979, então estava fazendo as contas aí, então faz 43 anos, né, que nós nos conhecemos e que somos amigos. Mas, recentemente, né, nos últimos 10 anos, mais ou menos, o George tem colaborado com o INEAC, ele é consultor internacional do INEAC, ele tem colaborado com o INEAC de várias maneiras, recebendo alunos lá na Hastings, né, que Frederico Policarpo, a Flávia Medeiros, o nosso colega aqui da UVA, Michel Lobo, né, todos eles fizeram um doutorado sanduíche lá na Hastings, sob a orientação dele, e tem vindo também participar dos nossos eventos de forma mais ou menos sistemática, né? e, inclusive, se solidarizando, né, conosco nesse momento difícil, né, todos nós enfrentamos na ciência, na tecnologia e na educação, né, por falta de recursos. E ele tem vários artigos publicados também, né, na Antropolítica, na Dilemas, né, e também num livro que a professora Fernanda Duarte, o professor Rafael Iori e eu mesmo organizamos sobre direito nos Estados Unidos e no Brasil, né? Esse artigo é um artigo muito importante, né, que é uma etnografia que ele faz do processo da plea bargain, que é muito importante exatamente para mostrar as características, né, do sistema dos Estados Unidos. Então, com essas palavras introdutórias, eu vou apresentar, né, vai iniciar a apresentação dele. Depois da apresentação dele, nós vamos voltar, né? E é como o pêndulo oscila, né? A oscilação da política criminal em São Francisco, né? Na cidade de São Francisco, da Califórnia, é onde ele trabalha, né? E quando terminar a exposição dele, eu vou voltar juntamente com meu colega Hector Martins, que é um doutor, nosso colega recém-formado aqui pela Veiga de Almeida, que vai lançar um livro também mais tarde, né, no evento de lançamento de livros, sobre a tese dele, sobre os cursos de Direito, e uma etnografia, né, dos cursos de Direito numa universidade privada. E vamos voltar, vamos fazer alguns comentários e vamos abrir para perguntas. E o professor Jorge estará participando e respondendo as perguntas e os comentários que eu farei e as perguntas que vocês fizerem, né? A apresentação dele é em inglês, mas está legendada, muito bem legendada, aliás, pelo nosso colega Wellington, né? Fez um trabalho muito, muito bom, muito positivo, né? Eu agradeço a ele, agradeço também a equipe que está transmitindo esse evento, ao colega que está lá, que eu desculpa, o nome de repente fugiu, minha cabeça está, né, bastante cansada hoje já, né? Então, sem mais delongas, por favor, inicia aí a transmissão do vídeo. O vídeo está passando sem som. Então, o Bruno... Desculpe, Bruno, eu esqueci seu nome da outra vez. O Bruno está tentando resolver o problema e nós vamos retomar a palestra do início assim que ele conseguir resolver esse problema técnico. Desculpem o incômodo causado.
Determine political resistance.
Pronto.
Now, I want to begin by sharing with you some salient characteristics of San Francisco, which you may or may not know, but which are directly pertinent to this topic. So first of all, at 47 square miles and with somewhere between 800,000 and 900,000 residents, San Francisco is one of the most densely, it is actually the second most densely populated city in the country following New York City. Second, its economy is greatly dependent on tourism, both recreational and business tourism, business conventions and the like, and also on the many commuters who flood into the city on a daily basis, like I did for all of my career, work in the city and then go home to neighboring communities. Third, San Francisco has a dwindling Black population. It was 13% of the city in 1970. It's now down to 5%. Okay, that's important. And then there is, in contrast, a durable, long-standing, well-organized, and politically influential Asian American community of about 34%. And then finally, what I want to say is that the city, San Francisco, occupies a particular place in the national political narrative. It has for long been seen as one of the most liberal and progressive cities in the country, and as a trendsetter in many ways. Same-sex marriage, for example, in 2004, then Governor Gavin Newsom recognized same-sex marriage first in the country, and then, of course, that spread across the country. It has also served as a launching pad for politicians. Politicians get their start in San Francisco and then go on to leadership at either the state level, like Newsom, governor back in 2004, mayor of the city of San Francisco in 2004, governor of the state of California now, okay? Also, Kamala Harris, our current vice president of the United States, she started her political career as the DA of San Francisco, went on to become the attorney general of the state, then the senator for the state of California, and then finally to the vice presidency. So what happens in San Francisco has national reverberations. Now, we here in this area generally are proud of this role, and San Francisco people, San Franciscans, take pride in their trend-setting and leadership role. However, to the right wing and to conservative states and cities throughout the country, and for national politicians as well, San Francisco is regarded with scorn and horror as sort of the worst you can possibly imagine. And of course, San Francisco, like other major cities, does have its problems, particularly with severe income inequality and homelessness and the like. And so the right wing is not without its evidence in looking to it holding up San Francisco as a negative example of where we should be going as a nation. Now, before diving into a sort of a detailed consideration of the Boudin administration and what happened under his roughly 2.5 years in office, I want to say one other thing about what progressive prosecution is all about and how it has emerged as a movement in this country. So, progressive prosecution is primarily a response to the phenomenon in this country of mass incarceration and racial inequity in the criminal justice system. Mass incarceration, as you may know, we, with something like 2.1 million people behind bars, have the greatest absolute number of people in prison, and the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world. And there are great racial inequalities in this whole scheme of mass incarceration. And as I have argued to you in the past and cited to you the work of Michelle Alexander, there are many people who believe, in fact, that this mass incarceration is all about race. It is the current means of maintaining white supremacy in the United States and keeping, in particular, Black and brown people in a subordinate status in this country. So progressive prosecution in its various forms, and it's not all the same in every place, is about reversing this through a variety of different kinds of reforms. And I think it's fair to call this a movement, partly because it sees itself as such. It is organized through various organizations, national in scope and state. Some of them are state-based. They see each other as comrades in a common struggle, and with progressive prosecutors now in place in San Francisco, Boudin now recalled, but Los Angeles, Orlando, Florida, Chicago, Illinois, and Seattle, Washington, a number of countries have elected progressive prosecutors, to the point that now tens of millions of Americans, Philadelphia actually is another very important one, tens of millions of Americans are now living within jurisdictions that are administered by progressive prosecutors. Okay, and then one other thing about progressive prosecution is that the whole sort of movement turns on the reality of prosecutorial discretion. In the American legal system, in San Francisco and everywhere else, there is this idea, this ideal, and a reality that prosecutors exercise virtually unbridled, unbounded discretion over decisions about who to charge, what crimes to charge, whether to charge at all, how to charge, and the like. So this power over charging is an immense power. It's an awesome power, and it has led many commentators, academic and otherwise, to the view that prosecutors are the most powerful officials in the criminal justice system. Okay, so for progressive prosecutors, this is a prize. If in fact traditional prosecutors have been one of the causes of mass incarceration, then one of the means of reversing mass incarceration is to seize these positions of special power and to exercise them in a different direction toward what might be called decarceration, which is the opposite of mass incarceration. So that's what the progressive prosecution movement is about. It is Chesa Boudin, when he was elected in 2019, was not the first progressive prosecutor in San Francisco. We have had a series of prosecutors, and the movement has been increasingly in the direction of progressive prosecution. It started off actually in the mid-90s, and we've kind of gradually migrated toward more and more progressive DAs, with Chesa Boudin being the most. Now, when Chesa Boudin was elected in San Francisco, he brought a very unusual pedigree to the office of the district attorney. His parents had been members of a leftist organization, which got involved in an armed robbery. They were actually just getaway drivers. They didn't pull any triggers, but they were getaway drivers. And in this armed robbery, it was of a Brinks armored car, carrying cash. Three people were killed, 2 police officers and 1 Brinks guard. And the parents, Chesa Boudin's parents, were apprehended, and they under felony murder principles, which are, if you if you commit a felony and in the process of that felony anybody is killed, you can be charged with murder whether or not you actually pulled the trigger. So they both went to prison. And Chesa, from the age of 14 months, was raised by foster parents, and he lived his life visiting his parents in custody behind bars. So he was the son of incarcerated parents. He obtained an absolutely stellar academic training. Went to Yale Law School, widely regarded as the best or one of the best law schools in the country. He came out to San Francisco and started working in the public defender's office and litigated one of the most influential and important cases that has come down in the state of California in decades. It was called In Re Humphrey, and it had to do with a challenge to our cash bail system. I'm not going to digress to explain what cash bail is all about. I don't think I have time, but please ask me about it in discussion if you're curious. So when he took over in 2019 as district attorney, imagine he is suddenly in charge of the very same attorneys that he had been facing as adversaries in court for the previous number of years. And to, I would say, aggravate this, he fired some highly respected prosecutors from the office, and then built his management team, including additional former members of public defenders from his old office. So, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but you can imagine that if you were in the Russian army today and all of a sudden there were a house cleaning and you found yourself being commanded by a bunch of Ukrainian generals, you'd be questioning that, let's say. So this is kind of what happened here in San Francisco. Now, this kind of house cleaning is actually not unique. When new district attorneys come in, it's pretty common for them to fire a bunch of people and hire a bunch of their people, their own management team who see things the way they do and who will help them administer as they want. And it has been particularly so of when progressive prosecutors have come into office in other places. For example, Larry Krasner, who was elected in Philadelphia, fired 31 attorneys like within days of his first election in, I think it was 2017. So this is not unusual, this kind of turnover, but it continued, and the churn in the office eventually resulted over the 2.5 years of Boudin's administration in 51 prosecutors, approximately a third of the office, either resigning or being fired. And you can imagine that few organizations can withstand that degree of turnover without disruption. And keep in mind that this was all occurring during COVID. So, all of this stuff, the challenge of building a new culture was being done virtually, which you can from your own experiences, you can infer how difficult that would be. Now, like I said, Boudin was preceded by another progressive prosecutor. His name was George Gascon, and I mention him by name because I'll be referring to him again later. Gascon actually resigned from San Francisco as DA and then went down to Los Angeles and ran for election for DA down there and won, and is now the DA of Los Angeles County. Nonetheless, there is little question that the policies that Boudin began to implement, they were perfectly consistent with his campaign promises. They were consistent with what one might call the playbook of progressive prosecution. So what couldn't have been a surprise to the voters of San Francisco. But they represented a fairly abrupt shift from the policies of his predecessor. So most of them had to do with the broad policy. The specific policies were expressions of a broad commitment to decarceration, which, as I've already said, is the opposite of incarceration. So getting people out of custody or not putting people in custody. And this was thoroughgoing, right? It ranged across the entire spectrum of criminal prosecutions, from decisions not to charge cases at all to decisions not to seek bail, so to allow people to stay out of custody prior to trial after they had been charged, to diverting people out of the criminal justice system to various forms of rehabilitation and treatment, and suspending criminal proceedings. If they complete their treatment, the case goes away, gets dismissed, to seeking non-carceral dispositions in plea bargaining. So when people did get convicted, they either didn't spend time in custody or they spent less time in custody, to seeking lower sentences after conviction at trial. And then Boudin even created a unit in the office to go back and to review cases of people who had already started serving their time, to review those cases to see if either sentences were too extreme or whether there were any problems in the legality and the quality of the evidence on which the convictions were based. And some of these cases were reversed, or people were allowed out of custody. So decarceration was a major theme in the Boudin administration. As I've said, another animating principle of the progressive prosecution movement as a whole, and certainly of Chesa Boudin's administration, was racial equity. Now, this is intertwined with the problem of mass incarceration, because mass incarceration vastly, disproportionately impacts Black people and other people of color, but really primarily Black people. So, some of the policies of some other policies, I should say, of Boudin's were directly aimed at establishing racial equity, and I think that's what you could say of his of a number of measures that he took, and I'd be happy to give you more details about them, about the question of police accountability, right? So directly following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May of 2020, Chesa Boudin introduced a number of policies to deal with instances of police misconduct and to actually charge police with crimes when they used force unjustifiably against civilians. So Boudin his office was the first nationally, I believe, and he maintains, to charge officers with homicides. There were two of them. So it was the first two cases, charged homicides against officers for actions that they took on duty. And of course, the victims in both of these cases that Boudin brought were Black. So one other thing that all of this, like I said, consistent with the general commitments of progressive prosecution. One very unusual thing that he did was to establish what he called the Economic Crimes Against Workers Unit. He did this within 4 months of taking office, and apparently it was the first of its kind the first of its kind in the United States. And in 2021, the unit brought a path-breaking set of civil suits against the food delivery service DoorDash, and then another corporation, for misclassifying gig workers. Now, you may know that gig workers are people who are treated in the law here in California and much of the rest of the states as independent contractors by their major companies, Uber, Lyft. There are a number, Instacart, that all sort of operate on this business model. And the reason they do that, of course, is because the corporations are not obligated to to pay benefits for gig workers as independent contractors, right? There's a lot of employment law that requires employees to take care of employees and to respect their rights in various ways, provide health care, et cetera, et cetera. Few of those obligations are owed to independent contractors. So, this suit against DoorDash, one of these gig worker companies, really sort of hit at the heart of the business model of a number of major San Francisco corporations. And then, as a sort of another theme in Boudin's administration and also in other progressive prosecutors, it is the effort to address the root causes of crime, to prevent crime, so that you don't even have people appearing in the criminal justice system. And so this was he did this through a suit against a number of out-of-state corporations that provided parts for what we call here in the United States ghost guns. These are guns that are made often out of stamped plastic and other such materials. There are different ways that they can be produced. They can be produced at home solely from, entirely from scratch. But you can also purchase over the internet parts and then assemble them at home. And home manufacture of weapons has never been regulated in the United States, whereas, of course, standard manufacture is regulated heavily, relatively heavily, not heavily enough, but home building is not regulated at all. So these guns are completely untraceable, and they have become, that's why they're called ghosts, because you can't see them, you can't track them down. Right. These guns have become increasingly popular among the, I don't like to call them criminal class, but they are involved, they are employed in crime. Now, when Chesa Boudin took office in January of 2020, nobody could have predicted how rapidly and radically life in San Francisco, as everywhere else in the world, of course, would shift just 9 weeks later. But it did, with the institution of a regional stay-at-home order on March 16th of that year, due to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So residents of the entire Bay Area were required to stay indoors, to venture out only for essential purposes, and not to travel more than 5 miles from our residences. And this went on until May of 2020. Restrictions, as you know, I mean, like many other places, were gradually loosened, but they actually haven't even disappeared to this day. We still have certain kinds of restrictions, indoor masks and the like, and sometimes they go away for a while, then they come back. So very, very, very disruptive. It's such a platitude to say, but this impact, the social, economic, and political impact of the pandemic were unlike, I would say, anything that this country has faced since perhaps World War II or the Great Depression in the 1930s. So, imagine this city so dependent on tourism, both from abroad and from other parts of the United States. And, it's a regional shopping hub, and it's a regional employment hub. So, hundreds of thousands of people would commute into the city on a daily basis. All of a sudden, all of this overnight comes to a stop, right? And the downtown of San Francisco is a complete ghost town. One difference between us and New York is that we don't have much of a mixture of commercial and residential areas. In New York, you live in a high rise and the bottom has, stores and the like. Not in San Francisco. It is our financial and business district is almost exclusively commercial with very few residents. So, the area was completely abandoned almost. Hotels and restaurants were all closed. Tourism, as I said, ground to a complete halt. And I'm not going to go into, I mean, there are many different ways in which the pandemic imposed unprecedented stresses on our lives. You all experienced it, so I won't go into it. Let me just, a couple of things to note are that homeless shelters in San Francisco were shut down. We have a very substantial problem of homelessness in San Francisco. It's one of the worst in the country. And it was exacerbated by the fact that these shelters, these nighttime shelters, were shut down. And so all that many more people in the streets. Same with jails. So, for the safety of prisoners, many were released into the community sooner than they would have, in essentially accelerating Boudin's decarceration policies, but on account of the pandemic. Now, let me turn to the impact of the pandemic specifically on crime patterns in the criminal justice system. It had very unpredictable and fascinating impacts. Not surprisingly, with most people at home and remote workers not commuting into the city. I mean, and this continued because remote work became an alternative, and people didn't return to commuting for a long time. Still have not. Perhaps not surprisingly, the overall crime rate in San Francisco plummeted. It went down. This was true of crimes in almost all categories, including violent crime. There were some exceptions. One was home burglaries, which skyrocketed by 50%. And then murders also increased by 17%. With respect to murders, however, consider that that only represented, in absolute terms, 8 more deaths in 2020 than in 2019. San Francisco is a kind of middling city in terms of crime overall, including violent crime, as compared to other cities in California, and especially as compared to cities in the eastern United States, where Chicago, for example, famously has a very, very serious problem of gun violence. San Francisco doesn't have that. So we went from 41 murders in 2019 to 49 murders in 2020. These are all lives. I don't mean any disrespect, but that's a relatively small increase as compared to other cities. And then the percentage of murders in other cities, including those nearby, like Sacramento, which is about 90 miles away from here, and has a conservative prosecutor, not a progressive prosecutor. The rates of violence there increased at a much higher rate. Some estimate between 26 and 35% increase in murders in other cities. Sorry, I'm going to turn my blind a little here. So, so that there was an uptick in murders, but as compared to other places, not really that great. Now, where crimes were occurring and who were the targets of crimes also shifted, and this is very, very important. It used to be, I mean, when I talk about the economy of San Francisco being dependent on tourists and commuters, I'm not just talking about the formal economy. I'm also talking about the criminal economy. So, criminals, people who depend for their livelihoods on regular engagement in crime, have traditionally focused on shopping areas where people leave, their goods that they've just purchased in their cars, while they go on and continue having lunch or to other stores. They have also focused on tourists who come in with their cash, with their fancy cameras, and generally speaking are identifiable by their language, by their appearances, by their clothing, etc. And they have been always been a favorite target of crime in San Francisco for all of those, all of those things that they bring with them, and also for the fact that if a person gets apprehended in, let's say, a street robbery of a Japanese tourist, that person knows that, because these people, I'm saying this because I'm just sharing with you things that my own clients as a public defender would share with me. They knew that these people would not be flown back here to testify against them at a preliminary hearing at great cost to the district attorney. And therefore, if they got caught, the odds of their case being dismissed before trial were fairly high. Okay. So, these people are no longer in the city. So what are you going to do if you depend on crime for your survival? You don't stop. You have to go elsewhere. And that's what happened. And so what happened was that car break-ins, which had been concentrated in these shopping and tourist areas, suddenly spread to residential neighborhoods, including wealthy residential neighborhoods that had suffered far fewer of them before the pandemic. And then home burglaries also were almost certainly due to the abrupt halt in tourist commuter traffic into the city. So if you think about it, this is a very significant shift, because what this meant is that a greater proportion of the burdens of property crimes went from non-voting tourists and commuters to San Francisco homeowners and renters who voted in the city. And of course, the intrusiveness and threat associated with home burglaries is considerably greater than was so of car burglaries. Another phenomenon that occurred during the pandemic was the uptick in what have widely been perceived to have been anti-Asian hate crimes, a high proportion of them, sadly, committed against elders. This was in keeping with national trends again. There was a 77% increase in reports of crimes against Asian Americans from 2019 to 2020. Now, this phenomenon has been widely explained as COVID-driven, fueled, unfortunately, by President Trump's repeated references to Kung flu and to the China virus and the like. And let me remind you here that this impacted San Francisco's 34% Asian population, and there were some highly publicized crimes that the media feasted on that occurred during 2020, 2021. Now, San Francisco criminal justice, the system, was not spared the disruption of the pandemic. Judges, court staff, attorneys for both prosecution and the defense, jurors, all of us were subject to the stay-at-home order just like any other citizen. So it was weeks, if not months, before the courts could gear back up. They adapted awkwardly to virtual proceedings, causing lengthy delays in trials. Virtual tools, provided a stopgap to trials and other ancillary services like Alcoholics or Narcotics Anonymous meetings. Better than nothing, but far less effective than in-person encounters. Now let me take a look at the recall effort and see if I can tease out for you why I think the recall effort was successful. So, first of all, recalls are the removal of public officials from office before the legally prescribed term that they would serve, absent the recall. And California and a few other states, I believe 18 other states, have recall provisions. They were an innovation of the early 20th century progressive era. And they, along with what are called referenda, referendum, singular, referenda, plural, if you go by the Latin, they were both conceived of as means of direct democracy. This was at a time of political corruption, distrust of elites, and the like. Historically, they have been fairly rare, but they have been increasing in number and popularity, and we see more and more of them. And ironically, what began as originally conceived of as a means of direct democracy has been captured by special interests, and especially moneyed interests. So, the people that these measures were originally targeted against have figured out a way to make use of them. And a lot of this has to do with the procedure. The way a recall works is that a number of citizens first file a notice. It's called a notice of intent here in California. Once it starts, it kind of starts the clock ticking on a window of time. And within that window of time, a certain number of signatures, and that what the number is kind of depends on the jurisdiction and the like. So a certain number of signatures have to be gathered. They have to be certified. And then if the requisite number is reached within that time window, the issue is the recall or the referendum is placed on the ballot for a special election. So why did the 2022 recall of Chesa Boudin succeed? So there's no single factor, but a multitude of factors which produce this, I would say, exceptional result. So first of all, San Francisco's small geographic scale, 47 square miles, and high population density made a recall more logistically and financially feasible than it would have been in a larger jurisdiction. Compare San Francisco, for example, to Los Angeles County. I mentioned to you that we have under 1 million people in San Francisco, 47 square miles. Los Angeles County is 4,723 square miles. In other words, 100 times as big as San Francisco, and has nearly 10 million people. So, the recall against Chesa Boudin had to gather 50,000 signatures. The recall, there have been now 2 recall attempts against George Gascon since he took office in Los Angeles. They had to gather 566,000 signatures, and they both failed. Okay, so a recall was simply more attainable, more within reach, especially for a well-funded, organized effort. The recall against Boudin was indeed organized and funded by a relative handful of wealthy opponents. So $7 million was spent in support of the recall, the yes vote. So let's remove Chesa Boudin from office. 80% of that $7 million came in donations of $50,000 or greater, and 3 individuals donated more than $500,000 each. One is reported to have donated nearly $1 million. Meanwhile, fewer than 10% of the recall campaign donations were under $10,000. So rich people funded the recall. The no campaign that supported Chesa Boudin's continuation in office pulled in just $3 million, and its donations were vastly of a much higher proportion of smaller donations. Now, I think I did not mention at the beginning that Chesa Boudin was elected by a relatively narrow margin of 51 to 49%. He ran against a more moderate Democrat and barely prevailed. Now, compare this to the point being that he began with probably a narrower and weaker foundation, not as great a mandate as progressive prosecutors have in other places. Compare, for example, Larry Krasner, who I've mentioned several times now, the DA elected first in 2017, then again in 2021 in Philadelphia. He won his first race by 50 points, and then he won his second race by 38 points. So, a much stronger mandate to begin with than Boudin had. And note that, strong mandates have been given to progressive prosecutors in cities with much larger Black populations than San Francisco. Our 5%, Philadelphia is 41%, and Los Angeles is 9%. So, if you consider the fact that mass incarceration has been primarily inflicted on our Black community, it's not a surprise that that progressive prosecutors have gained the greatest strength in places where that the impact of mass incarceration is most viscerally felt, and that is within cities with a strong Black minority. Now, it may be that San Francisco is a very progressive city when it comes to gay rights and to drug policies, but it may be that the support for progressive prosecution may have been thinner than it was wide. In other words, many San Franciscan voters may have supported criminal justice reform in the general and the abstract, while having reservations about concrete reformist measures, especially a robust decarceration strategy. There is an expression, by the way, a Democrat, that's Democrat being generally, more liberal, progressive, a Democrat is a Republican who hasn't been mugged and who hasn't been victim of a street crime. In other words, each progressive or liberal is one crime away from changing their perspective entirely. Now, there were a couple of very high-profile incidents, crimes that were that were committed in the city in 2020 and 2021 that were greatly amplified, especially by both social media, by private citizen, and also by the legacy media, by mainstream newspapers. Let me just read you a headline that came from our local CBS. That's one of the local television stations. Here's the headline: Victim in brutal Chinatown attack sues San Francisco DA Chesa Boudin amid shocking jump in anti-Asian hate crimes. Okay, so the media, to share another common expression with us. This is common in American journalism. If it bleeds, it leads. In other words, audiences respond to reports of crime, and so newspapers and television stations lead with reports of crime. It turned out in this particular case that many of the facts that had been claimed by the victim were actually untrue. And this suit that I referred to, it was a civil suit that was filed against Boudin, because he didn't charge a hate crime in this case, and then he negotiated a fairly moderate plea bargain for the defendant. The plaintiff in the civil suit, the Asian gentleman, withdrew the suit because it turned out that actually much of what he had claimed in the suit was false. But this thing went on for almost 2 years during almost the entire pendency of Boudin's administration, leaving the impression that he was completely insensitive to Asian American concerns. There was another major case in which a parolee, somebody who had been released from prison, committed a series of crimes that culminated in the killing of two innocent pedestrians, people walking in the city, and he was driving drunk. He had a gun in his car. He had methamphetamines, and he ran them over and killed them. Very, very sad, very tragic event. And of course, this guy had committed several crimes in San Francisco. They were minor crimes. They were nonviolent crimes. And what Boudin did, instead of filing new charges against him, he referred him to, Boudin, his office, referred this man to the California Department of Corrections. That's standard practice. It has been for decades. It used to go on when I was a public defender back, 30 years ago. It's also standard in other jurisdictions. The reason we do it is because California Department of Corrections, they're the ones who deal with issues of parole violations. They are very streamlined, very quick, very inexpensive, and it's a much more expedient way to send a person back to prison than filing a new case, which consumes a lot of resources, takes a lot of time, and the like. So, Boudin got blamed for pursuing a policy that everybody follows, but because this guy then went out and sadly killed a couple of people, Boudin was blamed for it. Now, let me say, and I'll be winding down shortly, by no means was the resulting anger and frustration of San Francisco voters directed exclusively at Chesa Boudin, at their district attorney. In fact, 3 members of the San Francisco Board of Education were recalled in February 22 over a series of actions that they had taken that I won't go into the details unless you want me to later. These 3 members of the board were recalled. And extensive polling done by the San Francisco Chronicle, which is the leading newspaper in San Francisco, directly after the recall, showed deep despair, anger, frustration toward all city officials, the mayor, the board of supervisors, the school board, everybody. People were fed up with the lack of progress on major problems that the city is facing. So I think it is not an exaggeration to say that had other city officials been, if their necks had been put on the chopping block instead of Boudin's, voters might have swung the axe with as much force as they did on Boudin, so he became the lightning rod for frustration and anger against city government writ large. It is not an accident, of course, that it was Boudin who was targeted by these moneyed interests, and not, for example, the mayor. The mayor, whose name is London Breed, she's a centrist Democrat. She's friendly to business interests. Boudin had showed his hand in these suits against the major corporations, and so he was not friendly to business interests. So it was, like I said, not a mistake that he was the one targeted, not other city officials. Now, there's no question that Boudin faced internal resistance from deputies within his office, and that was the cause of all of that churn that I described earlier. Now, like I said, also, this is absolutely typical. This is what happens when somebody takes over a prosecutor's office, and you have this long tradition of prosecutors who have been there, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years, all operating under the kind of traditional tough on crime mentality. And you have this new person comes in with a different philosophy and a different approach and a different set of policies. Of course, people are going to resist. So that actually is, George Gascon, for example, in Los Angeles, his the union representing his deputies has sued him in court for his attempts at reform. So the resistance that Boudin faced from within is not the reason that he was recalled. Gascon, as I already mentioned too, has survived 2 recall attempts in Los Angeles, notwithstanding this revolt from his deputies. However, what the internal resistance did provide was an opening for outside forces. There were 2 deputies in particular who resigned from Boudin's office, who had been in the office before he arrived, and they became vocal spokespeople. The 2 of them became vocal spokespeople, interviewing with television, appearing in political ads and the like. And so this gave a sort of an inside lever to the forces in support of recall. It's also the case, likely, that Boudin was undermined deliberately by the police. I'm checking my time and thinking that perhaps I need to leave that for discussion. But, basically, let me just say quickly that police were not making arrests, and they were telling civilians, this is, somebody calls them up, somebody's stealing the catalytic converter of my car. I can see them out there right now. They're sawing away and about to run off with this catalytic converter. So the police show up, they have the guy, and then they don't make arrests. And then they tell the homeowner, this DA that we have now, he's not going to file cases. Nothing's going to happen to this guy anyway. Why should we bother arresting him? So there was that kind of resistance. I'm going to just say that the mayor, London Breed, also was clearly not on the same page in her policies with Chesa Boudin. I'll just make that bald assertion, have to come back and defend it and provide facts on it in a little bit, if you wish. Now, the final 10-point margin by which the recall succeeded actually was narrower than anticipated. Polling going into the election suggested that Boudin would suffer a resounding defeat. He didn't. But what voting patterns showed and precinct analysis showed was that Boudin was felled essentially by a coalition of Asian American and affluent white voters. If you look at where the votes came from, those are the ones who voted against him, whereas the Black community, small though it was, voted largely in support of Boudin in favor of keeping him. Now, a few conclusions. I began by disputing the claim that Boudin's recall signified broad discontent with the goals of progressive prosecution, and saying instead that it was a unique confluence of circumstances specific to San Francisco and the unprecedented impact of COVID on San Francisco particularly that combined to explain this unusual development. I stand by that. Nonetheless, I think that there are some lessons that we can draw. Those of us like myself who are interested in seeing the experiment of progressive prosecution through to determine if in reality it offers a better alternative to what we've been doing over decades. There maybe are some things that we can do better differently going forward to avoid this kind of result. So first, don't laugh, but the first is don't try to introduce aggressive criminal justice reform at the beginning of a pandemic. Now, you may think I'm joking. I'm not. But I say this for 2 reasons. Number one, I say with confidence. Of course, one can never, hindsight is 20/20, but also, you can never prove a counterfactual. So, we can't remove the impact of the pandemic and say what the results would have been. However, I say with confidence that if the pandemic had not occurred, Chesa Boudin would not have been recalled. Not the pandemic, obviously, in itself, but all of the impacts that he had on society. So what, you might say? Okay, well, this is a unique event. It won't happen again. Well, what experts are telling us these days is that we should get used to the possibility that we will be facing pandemics repeatedly in the future. And between climate change and other matters, we are going to face disasters with regularity that may have impacts similar to the pandemic, whether it's floods, earthquakes, or anything else. And so maybe it's not just paranoid to suggest that reformers should tread lightly and carefully under challenging circumstances, which may become our new normal. Understand what the impacts are of these events before charging ahead. Second, what might be called the heroic model of criminal justice reform is not likely to succeed. Yes, prosecutors may be very powerful, but in fact, they are downstream actors with respect to crime. Many of the things that are needed, mental health and addiction services, housing, education, jobs, all of those things that are really necessary to address the root causes of crime, prosecutors don't control. So for this reason, it may be advisable to approach reform not only with comprehensive plans, but also to seek to advance them through electoral slates. In other words, candidates for local level offices campaign together on the basis of promises to collaborate in implementing comprehensive plans. I'm almost done. Third, while the urge to fulfill campaign promises is doubtless strong, and I know because I spoke with Chesa Boudin, and this is what he told me, progressive prosecutors must balance that urge to fulfill promises against the virtues of incrementalism. I'm going to just leave that one at that and try to explain later in discussion why I say that. Fourth, and finally, as much as progressive prosecutors may desire to work above the political fray, in today's day and age, that simply does not work. Everything that happens, all actions that a progressive prosecutor takes are going to be subject to scrutiny. They're going to be subject to social media exploitation, and they will be lied about and manipulated for political ends by enemies of reform. You can't go into a gunfight with a paperclip. So, to those of us who detest social media, like I do, this is a sad reality, but you have to pay as much attention to messaging and counter messaging as you do to actually forming and implementing policy. Now, I say that for people like me, sympathetic to progressive prosecution, or even simply fascinated, though skeptical of its promise, this is still a hopeful time, even in San Francisco. The person who has been appointed by the mayor on an interim basis to replace Boudin has been proceeding cautiously, rolling back some of his policies in a rather incremental way. I think that it is likely that she will be reelected in the special election that's coming up in November. She's in good standing to do that, and Boudin has elected not to join that election. However, there will be the next scheduled regular election will be in November of next year, in 2023. And I believe if Chesa ran again at that time, there is a decent chance that he could prevail and that he may still have the last word. Thank you. Now, that is with the exception of you. Now you have the last word. You have the opportunity to ask questions, and I really look forward to doing my best to answer them. Thanks so much.
Desculpe, estava tudo fechado. It was all closed. Well, thank you very much, George, for your talk. And I am very looking forward discussion with you. But I know that you have, a limit of time. And suppose you have only 15, it's 2:15 here. You have another appointment at
3 o'clock your time, I believe.
3 o'clock. Okay, so it's
45
we have
minutes.
45 minutes. Good. Yeah. I'll take care of it, and you too, probably. Well, I first of all, I would like to say that I loved it a lot, and the first feeling I had was that you were doing something similar to the social situation in Zululand. You see, about this kind of a bridge. I don't know if you remember the Gluckman article, but that the bridge, the construction, the building of the bridge, etc. It was very interesting, an ethnography of a situation, very complex situation, but you have certainly proceeded to explain and identify a lot of factors that caused it. Second thing I would like to say is that I would like to contrast this kind of progressive prosecution to another experience here in Rio de Janeiro, which was the pacifying police units, Unidade de Polícia Pacificadora, UPPs, which was a program during the Olympics and the World Soccer Cup and all these events, big events that they did in the city, especially in the south zone of the city, the beach zone of the city, to try to control the situation, the conflicts. And it was a public policy, but not from the prosecutor, because here, of course, the prosecutors don't have this kind of explicit mandate to produce public policies, but they do, but only in a way, implicit way. And it would be very interesting, because here was the executive who did it, but it was also a very complex situation, and the results were, very, very few results. It was not a very successful experience, especially because the lack of support of these other factors that you were talking about, and that they didn't control, social service and, education, health, and whatever, they didn't come. Only the police went to the morros, the favelas, the slums. The rest of the service didn't come, so it was frustrated, the strategy.
Right.
So the third thing is that I would like to, and then I have to say it in Portuguese, but first I'm going to tell it to you, because it would be very interesting to compare the discretion and the accountability of public prosecutors in San Francisco or in California or in the United States, with the mandatory, charge that we have here in Brazil, and no accountability. If you don't, they don't work. There is only the possibility of, suing somebody because he is guilty of something, of doing something wrong, but not for just choosing who is going to charge and who is not going to charge.
Right.
And that happens recently with the Judge Moro, intervention with Lula, et cetera. And the prosecutors who worked with him were, are being guilty of a lot of things. But one of them, I think only one, but maybe not only one, but at least one was elected, for the Congress, become a congressman. And the fourth thing, it was a suggestion that you would explain to the public, and we're going to translate the difference between recall and impeachment. You see, because we here use impeachment for everything, and Brazilians love to import institutes without knowing what they mean in their original context. And Michelle Lobo has two questions here written in English in the chat. And one of them, it's my curiosity, and I think you should also explain them. The problem of a cash bail problem that you said that he intervened in this policy.
Right.
Well, I don't know if Hector has any questions, but that's okay. Hein, Hector, você quer perguntar alguma coisa? No?
Não, Cante.
Okay, so please answer both questions of Michelle. And for me, I would be satisfied with the discussion between, recall and impeachment.
Sure. Okay, great. So first of all, thank you, everybody who worked to put this together, and especially whoever it was who spent must have been many hours translating my talk.
Wellington. Wellington is his name. Yeah, Wellington.
Yeah. So that's a lot of effort that I very much appreciate. So there's one little item that I'd like to clear up very quickly before I turn to the explicit questions. The title of my talk, you recall, itself involved a question, as the pendulum swings, with a question mark. And I think it probably was implicit in my conclusions, but I want to make explicit that I don't believe that the pendulum is swinging back in very much, and certainly that motion of swinging back is nothing like the mechanics of a clock. This is a political struggle over the direction of public prosecution, and how it moves, how far it moves. It's not inevitable that it'll swing all the way back to the right and then swing all the way back to the left. No, it's the product of political forces, and there might have been a minor correction, but it's not. Again, I want to make sure that everyone understands this is not anything mechanical or automatic. And the future, therefore, is quite open and indeterminate.
Let me translate for the,
Sure.
Sake of somebody didn't understand. Não sei se entenderam, mas ele diz que ele não está afirmando que esse pêndulo oscila, né? Que vai da direita, depois vai para a esquerda e agora vai para a direita, etc. Ele não acha isso. Acha que essa política criminal, né, é fruto de conflitos, né? Mas que ela não é pendular, como se costuma usualmente rotular, né? Costuma dizer que vai para a esquerda, depois vai para a direita, aqui no Brasil é muito comum, né? O sujeito entra um, faz uma coisa, entra o outro, faz outra coisa, mas ele acha que não. Ele acha que há uma continuidade nisso. Né? Okay, George, come on.
All right. So let me take the questions, the specific questions that you asked in sequence. So first of all, the distinction between a recall and impeachment. I'll start with impeachment. Impeachment is the process of the removal of an official from public office on account of misconduct of some kind or another. Now, whether the rules governing impeachment vary from state to state, and of course at the federal level as well. But for example, the impeachment of the two impeachments of Donald Trump were required to prove that he had engaged in what were called high crimes or misdemeanors. In other words, he had to have engaged in wrongful behavior of some kind, right? Now, the definition of what constitutes high crimes and misdemeanors is not clear, and requires looking back at past examples of impeachments and the like. But the fundamental requirement is that there be a showing of some kind of wrongdoing, however that happens to be defined. Recall, in contrast, it is also a means for the removal of an official from public office. It is not as widespread as in the United States, not as widespread. 19 of the 50 states have procedures for recalls, and the rest do not. So the majority do not. It's a political process, and it may be, although the initiators of a recall are required to make a statement as to why they are initiating the recall, there doesn't really have to be any proof of wrongdoing. It can be simply based on dissatisfaction with the performance of the official, and it can be based on policy grounds. People don't like the direction that the official is taking the government, and unlike impeachment is heard before a body within the government itself. So, for example, impeachment of the President of the United States is heard by the Senate. Okay. With a recall, it is the voters, it is the public that, assuming that the requirements are met, that they gain an adequate number of signatures that are certified to place the matter on the ballot, then it is the public that votes, not any governmental body.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me translate, please.
Yes.
Ele diz o seguinte: a diferença entre impeachment e essa recall, ou destituição, né, como foi traduzido pelo Wellington e por mim, é diferente, porque o impeachment precisa ter alguma coisa errada e dita, né, que é alguma coisa que o oficial, né, que está sendo impedido tenha cometido, né, seja um crime, seja uma coisa grave, né, como foi, por exemplo, o caso da Dilma, né, um negócio de coisa fiscal, né, e tal, mas quer dizer, é uma coisa errada, né? E quem vota, quem decide, é um colégio, né, específico que julga o impeachment, né? Então, no caso do presidente, é o Congresso, é o Senado, no caso do governador, né, eu não sei qual é, mas deve ser a Assembleia, etc. Já a destituição, não precisa ter nenhuma coisa errada, e basta a insatisfação, né, dos eleitores. E quem vota é o conjunto de eleitores daquele lugar de onde o o funcionário, vamos dizer assim, exerce suas funções, né, que ele representa na administração pública, né, seja da cidade, aí é diferente dos Estados Unidos aqui, mas se aqui seria do município, do estado ou federal. Então, essas são as diferenças. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado, hein, professor. Go ahead.
Okay, so now on the question of cash bail, this is this is a practice that is pretty much universal throughout the United States in criminal cases. When somebody is arrested and taken into custody, that is, they're taken by the police and put in jail, there has to be a judicial determination of probable cause to hold that person within 48 hours of arrest. This is according to the U.S. constitutional law, and the judge who is determining whether there is probable cause is also required to set a cash amount, bail, it's called, bail, which if the defendant can bring that money and deposit it with the court, he or she can go free out of custody. And the idea is that the bail acts as a guarantee that that person will return to court at their next court date and for the rest of the case. Okay? And a couple of things to keep in mind here. This is pre-trial, and we have a presumption of innocence. So, which is only defeated when the person either pleads guilty or is found guilty by a jury. Okay? So we're talking about people who are ostensibly innocent at this stage, right? And they're being required to put money in order to be free. Okay, now, in practice, an industry has developed, which is called the bail industry, and we have bail bondsmen. And the way that the industry operates is that they are actually the ones who deposit a bond or a promise of payment with the court in return for the private individual, the defendant who is in custody, paying a fee, which is usually 10% of the bail amount. Okay? If the person doesn't appear in court, the bail amount is forfeited, right? And the fee that is paid is gone regardless, right? The person pays it, they never get it back. Now, it's obvious, I think, that this is a practice which benefits the well-to-do and penalizes poor people who can't afford even the 10%. And bail amounts can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the nature of the case. It's the amounts are determined by the courts. They usually, for example, in each county, they will the judges meet and they define what's called a bail schedule, and it has presumptive amounts for different kinds of offenses, and they may be as low as $1,000, meaning that a person can pay $100 to a bail bondsman and get out of custody, or they may be hundreds of thousands of dollars if it's a serious crime, right? Do you want to translate that much, or shall I continue?
Well, I think you may continue. I can't. I know this. I know the system. You know,
Okay.
it's easier for me to explain it.
So, so judges take this schedule, the bail schedule, and then they have before them an individual, right, in court. A defendant is in court, and they are supposed to tailor the bail amount to the crime and to the individual. If the individual has a long record of failing to appear in prior cases, the judge may set high bail in order to guarantee that that person comes back. Or if the person, on the contrary, has a record of very regular appearances in court, they may set bail in a low amount. It is also feasible for judges to allow people to, not put up any bail. That is a possibility. It is also possible at the other extreme for them to deny bail completely. So if the person has committed a murder or a heinous crime, a rape, violent rape, or whatever, no bail is also an option. Now, what has happened over the last few years in California, partly, in fact, largely due to the efforts of the San Francisco Public Defender's Office in litigation in which Chesa Boudin played a leading role, they challenged the whole cash bail system as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution and the equivalent clause in the California state constitution, saying that it's unfair, it's unjust, it's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause not to consider the actual financial circumstances of the defendant and just to set bail in the abstract. It has to, you have to consider whether a bail that reflects the actual financial circumstances of the individual so that poor people actually have a chance of getting out of custody. $10 to a poor person is a lot of money. That may be plenty to guarantee their return to court. Okay. Now, I mentioned that the whole system of recalls and referenda have been kind of appropriated by moneyed interest. Well, the bail, after this case, the bail industry sponsored an initiative to try to reinstate the cash bail system. That has been challenged in court. So we're currently in a situation of sort of flux and uncertainty how things are actually going to play out. But that's the cash bail system and where it currently rests in the state of California.
One last question. And if the guy doesn't appear, which is the bail that is retained by the justice? I mean, it's 10% or is 100%?
It's 100%. It's 100%. Now, what this means, though, is that it essentially creates this private class of law enforcement because the bail bonds people send, because they have the 90% of the money at stake, they send people out to find the person and bring him back into court. You see? Yeah. So it's a way of, it's a way of kind of deputizing private actors to do the court work and go out and bring people into court.
Yeah, that's it. I'm going to translate now.
Yeah.
É o seguinte, a fiança, né? Bail é fiança, né? A fiança em dinheiro precisa ter uma causa provável, né? Quando o sujeito é levado ao juiz, né? E aí o juiz estabelece uma quantia que deve ser de acordo com o crime e de acordo com os antecedentes da pessoa, em termos de ela ter já sido acusada de alguma coisa e ter comparecido ao tribunal para as outras, né, os outros ritos, né, processuais e tal, inclusive o júri, se for o caso, e aí ele estabelece uma quantia, né? E normalmente a pessoa vai no que eles chamam de bailman, né, ou bondsman, né, que é um sujeito que é especializado em fornecer essa fiança, né, mediante o pagamento a ele, né, esse sujeito, de 10% do valor da fiança, né? Então, sempre $100 mil, o cara chega lá, dá $10 mil, ele afiança. Se o sujeito não aparecer, esse cara, o bailman, né, ele perde os 100%, que foi o que eu perguntei para o George. Então, o que acontece? Esse pessoal tem uma indústria, né, de caçadores de fugitivos que vão atrás dos fugitivos para o sujeito não perder o dinheiro, né? E, evidentemente, eles fazem o serviço da justiça, né, de mandados de prisão, né? Aqui no Brasil, a gente sabe que tem uma porrada de mandado de prisão em aberto e que você só pega o cara no mandado de prisão em aberto, não porque você está procurando o cara, a não sei que seja um caso de repercussão muito sério e tal, que aí vai atrás da pessoa e tal, mas fora isso, ninguém vai atrás de ninguém, e o que acontece é que o cara acaba sendo detido, né, por infração de trânsito, ou por causa de briga no bar, não sei o quê, aí o nego vai olhar a folha corrida dele e ver que ele está em liberdade condicional, né, e aí traz ele, e que ele violou, né, a liberdade condicional, e bota ele na cadeia de novo, né? E aí o que aconteceu lá com a promotora, o promotor, né, que ele tá, a história dele, é que eles entraram na justiça, né, contra esse sistema todo, essa indústria toda lá em São Francisco, alegando que ela fere a causa constitucional do que se chama de Equal Protection Clause, né? Quer dizer, de causa de proteção da justiça a todos, né, de maneira igual, e que, portanto, a fiança não podia ser fixada pelo juiz em cima só dessa ideia da gravidade do crime e do sujeito, dos antecedentes dele de aparecer diante da justiça, quando depois de liberado, né, mas ainda durante o processo, em abstrato, né? Tinha que saber quais são as condições financeiras da pessoa que está sendo acusada, porque, às vezes, como ele disse, $10, $20, $50 são, né, para quem é muito pobre, isso aí é uma quantia importante e asseguraria que ele iria voltar a tal. E o bailman, né, não vai ficar fazendo negócio também, né? Ele não falou isso, quem está falando sou eu, mas eu entrevistei alguns deles lá em São Francisco, né? Quer dizer, ele vai também, não vai ficar perdendo o tempo dele por causa de $5, né? Quer dizer, ele vai fazer isso em casos em que ele vai ter algum ganho, né, expressivo em fornecer essa. Aí o que ele está dizendo é que essa indústria de fiança, né, acabou também querendo fazer um referendo, né, para anular essa ação, né, da promotoria, né? O que é interessante nisso, né, é que aqui no Brasil seria a Defensoria Pública que faria isso. E lá quem está fazendo isso, talvez vocês não estejam, né, deve estar todo mundo atento e tudo, mas, né, é típico da Defensoria fazer isso, mas quem estava fazendo isso lá era a promotoria, né? Era o Ministério Público, né? Aqui a gente chama de Ministério Público. Ok, George. Go ahead for the second question of Michelle.
Right. So I'm not aware of I guess I should say, first of all, Michelle, plea bargaining as such was not the focus of this recent research. So what I know about it is the product of it is sort of a byproduct of my discussions about the recall and why it succeeded. But I did learn a few things. So the only direct impact of COVID on plea bargaining is that it became a purely virtual online process. In the distant past, when I was in practice, plea bargaining was always conducted face-to-face, in face-to-face meetings between lawyers, the defense lawyer and the prosecutor, often but not always with the mediation of a judge, depending on the stage of the case and the like. So that was the way it was in the old days. As as email began to be more part of practice, it was common that offers would be exchanged via email in advance of hearings, but then the parties would meet and continue to discuss and decide, whether they had a resolution or not. So it was a hybrid of online and direct personal communication. During COVID, it became, of course, purely online. Now, did plea bargains against some new groups increase? If you mean by increase in severity, like the harshness of punishment, no. What happened under Chesa Boudin's administration, not really related, I think, to COVID, but to the fact that he really was aggressively pursuing a policy or policies of decarceration. Plea bargains, the severity diminished quite a bit in a lot of cases, and particularly in cases, I think that sort of a major dividing line was that he crossed, that Chesa Boudin crossed, were in crimes involving violence. He was willing to go further with non-carceral bargains and shorter sentences in the events of convictions than any predecessor. He was, and this is, why I mentioned his background as the son of incarcerated parents. He was truly against incarceration in a way that was not true of any of his predecessors, however progressive they were. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why he evoked such opposition from among his deputies. And by the way, in doing this research, I spoke to 3 prosecutors who had worked under him and under the people who preceded him. And this is what they told me. They couldn't go along with not seeking bail, for example, for somebody who had assaulted somebody, committed a crime of violence against somebody. They just couldn't agree with it. They couldn't they couldn't go that far. There was one other practice impacting plea bargaining that I learned about in the process of my research. Again, mainly coming from these prosecutors, former prosecutors that I spoke with. And they said that Chesa, the top DA, would get involved in individual cases in plea bargaining. So, attorneys from his former office, the public defender's office, when they're negotiating with their counterpart who's actually handling the case, would copy Chesa. In other words, they would go over the heads of the line prosecutors and use their prior friendships and collegial relations with Chesa Boudin in order to obtain more favorable plea bargains for their clients, and he obliged them in some cases. And this raised, I think, this was probably not a smart practice for Chesa Boudin. As a pure management, forget the politics, but as a pure management thing, you know, if you're a line prosecutor, you normally have discretion over your case, right? Not you don't make the policies. The parameters of deals are laid out by superiors and the like. But when it comes down to handling your own case, you know that you know the facts. You've looked the defendant in the eye, at least in pre-COVID circumstances. You know you know your case the best. Your boss comes in over your head and negotiates with the defense attorney. It makes you look irrelevant. It makes you look powerless, right? Yeah. So that was a problematic practice, to say the least. The other concern that this raised, and this was specifically pointed out to me by one of the prosecutors I interviewed, is the prospect of unequal justice. You know, San Francisco files something like 20,000 cases a year. Chesa Boudin can't get involved in 20,000 cases. He can get involved in a handful of cases, and those people end up getting better deals as a consequence of his intervention than anybody else. And that creates inequalities in the outcomes of criminal cases. And
E congelou o homem. Congelou. E caiu.
Caiu. Deve ter travado lá.
Lá vem ele. Não. Pelo visto. Bom, eu anotei aqui a resposta dele e eu vou aproveitar para falar porque ele tem que sair às 3h, né? E já são, aqui no meu relógio, são 8 para as 3. E aí talvez ele não volte, né? O que será uma pena, para a gente não pode se despedir dele. Mas ele diz o seguinte, que o que aconteceu é que a plea bargain se tornou virtual, né? Não é tete-a-tete entre o advogado de defesa e o promotor, né? Mas o Boudin, ele estabeleceu uma coisa que desagradou muito até mesmo os progressistas que trabalhavam antes lá no escritório, que foi não querer pena de prisão para os crimes de agressão, né, que ele chama de assault, né, que são lesões corporais, né? Então, esses crimes, quando tem violência, ele quer ir para a cadeia. O juiz, inclusive, eu vi vários juízes lá em São Francisco, dizer, bom, se tiver violência, eu não solto, né? O cara tem que ficar na preventiva. Tal. Com violência, aqui nessa vara, não solta. Então, que não tinha violência, ele fazia fiança, ou soltava sem fiança mesmo, mas se houvesse qualquer... E uma vez eu vi ele botar um cara na cadeia que o cara estava com a garrafa e jogou a garrafa no chão, mas ele achou que aquilo era uma violência. Ou jogou a garrafa numa vitrine, acho que foi isso, jogou a garrafa numa vitrine, e quebrou a vitrine, aí a violência, aí prendeu o cara. Então, tem essa representação, né, do que é a violência e de que a violência merece encarceramento. E o Boudin resolveu não fazer isso, né? Resolveu porque, e diz, o George é por causa dos pais dele, né, que eram encarcerados, e ele realmente era o que a gente chama de, como é que é o nome mesmo, Hector? De abolicionista, né? Ele era mesmo um abolicionista, quer dizer, um sujeito que era contra o encarceramento, né, por causa do negócio dos pais dele que ficaram na prisão a vida toda, aparentemente, né? A outra coisa que deu como uma complicação com ele, a segunda coisa, é que ele deixava os defensores públicos que ele conhecia do escritório onde ele tinha trabalhado como defensor público interferirem diretamente com ele no negócio que os promotores estavam fazendo com os defensores. Então, os defensores apelavam para ele passar por cima do promotor e dar uma plea bargain, né? Dar uma barganha, dar um negócio melhor, né? Para o caso dele. E isso, diz o George, que foi uma burrice de gestão, né? Porque ele acabou, vamos dizer, passando por cima, né? Desautorizando os promotores, e aí eles ficaram, claro que ficaram danados da vida com ele, que uma coisa é que isso eles fazem lá, né? Estabelecer parâmetros, né? Para essas plea bargains, né? Tem limite mínimo e limite máximo de acordo com o crime, né? Mas a outra coisa é o caso, né, que o cara está acusando e que, porra, né, ficar interferindo, né, o promotor-chefe interferindo no negócio dele ali, ele não é uma desautorização, né? Passou por cima, né, como a gente costuma dizer. E, em terceiro lugar, que isso produzia uma desigualdade de tratamento, porque as pessoas que podiam falar com o Boudin tinham um tratamento melhor. E quem não podia, cifo, né? E como ele tinha, lá em São Francisco, eles julgam 20 mil casos desses por ano, é lógico que ele não podia interferir nos 20 mil, né? Ele só podia interferir naqueles que ele conhecia, etc. E isso provoca aquela história, né, que a desigualdade aqui está naturalizada, mas a de lá não está. Então, lá o que está naturalizado é igualdade, né? Então, qualquer sinal de desigualdade é mal visto. I was just explaining to the public what you said. I was just finishing my explanation, when you appear. So we are very synchronized, in our movements, including, you going out and coming in. That's wonderful. It was just in time. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah. Great.
Yeah. Well, I said what I translated what you said.
Okay.
And I think it was very, very clear. Right? So I don't know if there are any other questions. Anyway, Professor Bisharat has to leave at before 3, has an appointment at 3 o'clock, or another meeting, I don't know. But anyway, has a commitment of his time at 3 o'clock. And I really only have to thank you very much for the wonderful talk and the wonderful discussion also. As always, you are very explicadinho, very explaining person. You explain everything. It's very, very analytical, and a wonderful quality that you have. So I have only to thank you very much, and we'll get together next week at the 9th seminar, and I also invite all the people who are participating in this of this talking to our 9th seminar. There is another conference by Professor Bisharat on the colonial violence, or the violence, the colonialism, settlement colonial violence, quer dizer, o colonialismo de colonização, né? Quer dizer, a violência da colonização na Califórnia. Ele estudou isso, o tal negócio do Hastings, que eu tinha explicado agora, e ele também está fazendo uma pesquisa aqui na Amazônia, né, sobre essa violência também, esse projeto, né, de colonização da Amazônia que está rolando, com o agronegócio e o gado, né, etc. E temos uma pessoa com pós-doutorado, a doutora Paloma, trabalhando com ele. E então ele vai falar sobre essas questões no 9º seminário. Vocês podem entrar no site do INEAC, tem toda a programação do 9º seminário, que começa na semana que vem. E por aqui, então, eu me despeço de vocês todos com quem eu estou falando. And I also, say thank you very much, and hope to see you next week, and hope to see you in person next year. Certainly, we have to meet in person because it's much more pleasant. And of course, after this kind of activity, you go and have some, beer, and that's Professor Bisharat, as myself, is a very appreciate a lot beer. He is also a blues singer, one of the more important blues singers in the United States. He has a site that talks about that. Estou dizendo que ele gosta de cerveja e que eu estou convidando ele para ano que vem a gente fazer isso pessoalmente, para depois da palestra a gente tomar uma cerveja, que eu também gosto muito, todo mundo sabe disso. E estou dizendo que ele também é um cantor de blues, né? Uma revelação, ganhou um prêmio, revelação lá nos Estados Unidos. Tem um site também, quem quiser procurar, procura. E esse 9º seminário está no 9º seminário, que vai acontecer semana que vem, desculpe. Ele tem uma palestra lá também, assim como o Antônio Carrapon, aquele juiz francês, também tem uma palestra. Eu não sei exatamente os dias, mas é só entrar lá no site do INEAC, né? INEAC, e localizar o programa desse seminário. Então, com isso, Hector, você quer falar alguma coisa?
Thank you, George, for your presentation. E, Kant, lembrar que às 3h tem a palestra da Lana Lage.
Isso, eu estarei também junto com a Lana Lage, infelizmente para vocês. Eu hoje estou com o rabo sentado nessa cadeira aqui, de maneira enraizada, entendeu? Coisa triste. Já estou com o negócio do traseiro, já está quadrado, né? A bunda já está quadrada de ficar aqui. Mas tem a professora Lana Lage vai falar, né, do
Tribunal
Fala
do
aí,
Santo...
Lector.
Isso. A professora vai falar sobre o Tribunal do Santo Ofício, da Inquisição, né? E a perseguição aos solicitantes no Brasil colonial. E aí
é o livro dela que ela acabou de lançar, né? Que ela é um calhamaço, um tijolaço, mas é muito interessante. E eu vou comentar a influência que o estudo dela sobre a Inquisição teve no meu estudo, na minha etnografia sobre a polícia, né? Então, fazer essa ligação foi uma coisa muito... ajudou muito, e foi uma coisa muito original, né? Porque os historiadores realmente, né, costumam ficar presos, né, à sua época, né, a época que eles estudam, né, e não pegar essa coisa de hoje em dia ser uma coisa parecida com 1600, realmente não é habitual, né? Mas a professora Lana é uma historiadora excepcional e muito competente, tal. Aí isso fica para a próxima, então. Já vai começar. Quem quiser, tiver curiosidade, acompanhe. É outro link, né? Ou é o mesmo link?
Outro link, isso, outro
link, né? Outro link. Okay, George, we were talking about what follows the Lana Lage. She just finished and published a book on confessions.
Interesting.
I don't know pelo avesso como é que é, mas confessions on the reverse side. The reverse side of a confession. Yeah.
False confessions?
No, it's the other side of confession. Huh?
I see.
There is a confession, but what happens in the behind the confessions, behind the confessionary? What is behind the confessionary and the confessions? And that's a book that she just published that she's going to comment, and I have to comment also because it has a lot to do, had a lot to do with my research in the 80s with the police in Canada.
Sure. Yep.
See you then, George.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Vou sair aqui, Cante.